So let's do a somewhat brief, you probably not brief enough that you would like to, as brief as you would like it to be, but brief from my perspective, a brief crash course on each of these four subfields so you understand them better. The first one is called cultural anthropology, or sometimes, especially in Britain, social anthropology, or sociocultural anthropology, or as I call it, the greatest of all anthropologies. No, I'm just kidding. A little anthro joke for if any of my coworkers who are archaeologists are listening. Anyways, on a basic level, cultural anthropology looks at our lives as social beings. It looks at the study, or it studies human communities and their cultures, particularly human cultures living today. Okay, so you will find anthropologists, for example, going and working with let's say the Hadza group in Tanzania to better understand their hunting practices and why they have such fantastic heart health. Or you might find an anthropologist, for example, doing participant observation with raves back when that was more of a prominent news topic up in Seattle about 15 years ago, and trying to better understand what it is that people are doing and why they're doing it there. As you can tell from those two examples, cultural anthropologists truly do their fieldwork all over the world and are interested in all sorts of different communities and their cultures. One thing I did want to briefly mention, because it fits here, I guess, better than most places, is that there is a habit that some anthropologists have. I don't know if I'd call it a bad habit. I would call it an odd habit. I try to avoid it, but I sometimes fall into it. And it's called the ethnographic present. But what it means is sometimes an anthropologist wrote about a culture, let's say 60 years ago, and maybe they in turn were interviewing somebody from 30 years before that. That would mean that what they're describing is somebody they spoke to back in, let's say, 1960, and what they're actually talking about is stuff that happened in 1930 that the people in 1960 remember. Well, that's a long time ago, right? And a culture could have changed, probably has changed tremendously since that time period. So if we're talking about, as one example, because this is what I particularly have in mind because I just read it this morning, a study of tribal warfare in Highland New Guinea, but it's really from 1930, it would not be accurate to say, oh, the Tsembarig, that was the group that was being talked about in this study, the Tsembarig do such and such, because, well, the Tsembarig did such and such warfare nearly 100 years ago, right? So sometimes when we say, oh, the such and such culture does such and such in cultural anthropology, what we really mean is when the research was done on this culture, such and such was being practiced, but the research could be 100 years old, right? And so I'll try to make it clear when that's the case and when that's not, when we're actually talking about the present day or when we're talking about the relatively recent past. And to you, you're saying that doesn't sound relatively recent, but to anthropologists, when we're working on timescales of literally hundreds of thousands of years, 100 years ago, yes, a ton has changed, but it is, quote, relatively recent, right? We can still talk to people who might remember what happened then. But anyways, we study present day living cultures and what they're up to. And some of our big focus is on what it's like to live in a community and how cultures shape us and how we shape cultures, how all of that impacts us as an individual. We consider that to be one of the driving forces in sort of human life is our life as community beings. How we make meaning, how we contest or push back against the meanings that are taught to us, the structures of our lives, sort of what's a president? What's a Highland New Guinean bigman? What's a monarch, right? What are these things? What are the structures of our society? And how have these things changed over time? And of course, within that, nobody can study all things within that of present day cultures, so we tend to specialize. For example, your professor, again, tends to specialize in cultural anthropology of religion and the environment, okay, and to a lesser degree, language and politics. So yeah, and really kind of looking at this big question of how do human societies respond in diverse ways to the common human concerns, such as how to structure families, how to get food, how to establish order, how to grapple with meaning. Basically all the controversial topics you're not supposed to talk about over dinner, right? You've ever heard the phrase like, don't bring up politics or religion at the dinner table? Well, those are our bread and butter culinary pun intended. So since culture by their natures are complicated but also interconnected, again, we tend to specialize. Now, let's talk about a few key concepts in cultural anthropology. The first one is, and this is going to totally just like shock you, but is culture. There's lots of ways to define culture. We don't mean like somebody being cultured, as you'll sometimes hear people say. We mean culture is a bigger concept, meaning a community's shared learned ways of thinking, of communicating, of acting, the things that you have in common. The fact that when we see red lights as folks living in the United States, we know that a red light means stop, and you presumably learned that somewhere, and we're not born knowing it, so it's culture. And of course, the related concept of cultural relativism, that if we want to understand the practices or the behaviors of another group of people, we have to understand them in context. For example, I have here a picture of nuns from Jainism, which is a religion from South Asia, specifically India. And Jain monks and nuns are known, among other things, for wearing coverings over their mouths so that they do not accidentally ingest small organisms like insects or other beings. And of sweeping the ground before them sometimes so they don't accidentally step on insects. Now, depending on your own personal views on insects, that may sound very strange or perhaps very awesome, depending on how you feel about insects. But it's based within a cultural context, a religious context, which recognizes a concept of ahimsa, of nonviolence, and also a concept of karma, but understood a little differently than it is in most strains of Hindu thought. Karma, where it's almost like a substance that weighs you down and stops you from transcending, literally lifting up into an enlightened state. And you gain karma by, among other things, hurting animals and other organisms, even accidentally. So this behavior makes complete and utter sense in context, right? And that's what cultural relativism is, putting in the context so that we can understand better our fellow human beings. Other important concepts, social group is a big one, or we'll often say society, or I will often say community, because I find it to be a term that most people nowadays use a lot more commonly than social group. But community, basically a group of human beings that interact with each other regularly, and we tend to focus on, within that, on social structure, i.e. who fills what roles. And so, for example, this is a chart of ancient Hawaiian kingship prior to colonialism, and there was a structure there, right? There was a monarch, there was an elite class of people that helped with the royal household and that made sure that things were properly dealt with and that administered the land, and then there were farmers, right? So there was a structure to it, and that's part of what we focus on and compare across different societies, their different structures, right? Every society has a social structure. There is no just like pure chaos society, but we try to understand what the structure is, what roles people play. We also try to understand, though, agency and power within those structures, the way in which people try to get their way in a society, and the way in which other people push back, and the individualism of people. Another key concept is social constructionism. We will talk about that in a couple of modules. You're probably already familiar maybe with the concept. Whether or not you are, you don't need to know right now, other than to know that a big focus for us as anthropologists that do work on culture is how radically our cultures can shape how we view the world around us. We live in one world, yet in a sense we live in many worlds. And I don't mean that to sound like all like hippy dippy and profound. What I mean by that is we perceive things very differently based on culture. All right, so what are our methods? What is our main method? No, not our method man. How did that slide get in there? Just kidding, another little attempt to be funny. Classic rapper, Method Man, maybe before some of your time. Anyways, cultural anthropology's main methods include the following. The first is ethnography. That's really kind of our bread and butter. Rather, we should say ethnography is sort of all the methods tied together, because what ethnography means, as I put here, the goal is to graphy the heck out of ethno. In the ethnography comes from the Greek for writing and people. And so the idea here is we do research that allows us to write or speak or give a talk about a group of people, and to do it well, to encapsulate what it is that makes a community what it is and what they're all about and how they live their lives. And we do that in a few different ways, the biggest of which is fieldwork, going and spending time in a community. That can be extensive, and that was sort of the classic model, was like anthropologists going out and studying or spending time in a community for a year, 2 years, truly becoming immersed. Sometimes if you're an applied anthropologist working for the World Bank or something, you maybe have 3 weeks to get on the ground and do a project really quick because you're trying to figure out, hey, what are the needs in this community, or what are the opinions in this community. So that's fieldwork, is spending time there. And well, there, not just sort of hanging out, although some of it probably looks like just hanging out and you're wondering, how does anybody get paid to do this? But there's specific kinds of techniques you do while you're there. One of which is what we call participant observation. Participant observation, in a nutshell, means participating. It's going to shock you. We're really creative with how we name things in anthropology. It means participating in the life of a community and observing the life of the community. And our point of view, our perspective, and we base this on decades of having done this, is that the best way to get to know how a community does things is to go and do those things with them and to observe what's going on. There are many, many nuances to, let's say, a religious ritual that don't come out when you're just reading a historical account of it, or don't come out if you're just sort of surveying people about it from afar. You gotta go, you gotta immerse yourself in it. There's something different about studying a newspaper article about a protest movement versus actually going and protesting with them. And boy, okay. Sorry about the weird pause. My son came in and he was like, he had a cut on his hand, so I had to like, and he's young, he's like 3, so I had to like jump up and like go help him out with that. So not just be like, hey, I'm lecturing, leave me alone, right? So anyways, I had to take care of him, so I am back. So while we're out there, while we're doing field work, we do participant observation. We spend time in a community, right? Going and protesting with the community, being on the front of a protest, right? You get to know what people are up to, what it feels like, why they do, what they're saying, the kinds of conversations that come up when somebody's not taking a survey or something. It's a powerful way to get to know people's worlds. And then also interviews. A lot of times unstructured or semi-structured interviews, sometimes with a questionnaire, sometimes not, sometimes more just like these things we call conversations, right? And then also we do sometimes do surveys, for sure. Definitely can be a very useful method, especially once you've spent time in the field and then you want to try to see like, how widespread a certain idea is. Surveys can be really useful, or to kind of flesh out an understanding of a social structure. PGIS, or participatory mapping, basically spending time with the community and having people tell you what are the meaningful places to them. Lots of different things we do, but that's kind of our bread and butter, is spending time and talking with people. And it turns out that is a very compelling and fascinating way to get to know people. A little bit of history about kind of where all that came from, cultural anthropology. There's a lot of different ways to tell this story. This is one specific way we could tell it. People have been traveling around to other people and writing about them for millennia, right? We can go back definitely well into sort of medieval Islamic times, for example, or ancient Greek historians, to find people that spent time around other people and wrote about it. Definitely. More recently, anthropology, as we know the field now, you can think of its rise as coming in part from the encounter between European and non-European peoples, starting in sort of the 1700s and 1800s. Well, I mean, obviously earlier than that, but is sort of that happening parallel with this sort of rise of, political philosophers and people that thought that you could, think systematically or scientifically about humanity, that eventually led to the birth of this kind of idea of studying cultures systematically. And it's changed tremendously since then. I think we've become a lot more humble about the idea that we could ever, on any sort of level, develop sort of universal laws for humans or something. But that's kind of where it rose. But it also arose in a context where so there was this context, though, as Europeans were traveling and exploring and bluntly colonizing, and taking over in different parts of the world. They started to encounter cultures that were very different from some of the cultures that Europeans were already familiar with from the Middle East and certain parts of Asia, and certain parts of very North Africa. They started having a much broader exposure to many different cultures, as did other cultures, right? A lot of people all over the world, this was the start of modern globalization. People were getting to know cultures much further away than they classically would have. Cultures have never been isolated, but this was a time period where suddenly things were becoming a lot less isolated. And so you had sort of people writing about their experiences, oftentimes in ways that were woefully simplistic and stupid. So for example, one early traveler wrote that Navajo people didn't have a religion. Nothing could be further from the truth. Navajo people have an incredibly complex religion that many different scholars have written entire books about. Both Navajo and Navajo scholars, self-included, who have written a lot about it. So it's mind-blowing how wrong a lot of early explorers and colonizers and missionaries and different things. Some things they got right, a lot of things they got wrong. You had then the rise of the armchair anthropologists, people like Emil Durkheim, who read the different accounts from travelers and historians, travelers, tried to find the best stuff, tried to compare it to what we were learning about human beings from the social sciences and come up with theories. Some of their theories were really good and valuable and interesting. A lot of what they were coming up with was nonsense, partly because they weren't spending a lot of time in these communities. It's hard to really get to know the meanings of, let's say, a religious ritual if you've never actually talked to the people who follow that religion. And so then, though, we saw the rise of fieldwork. It started arguably in the late 1800s with groups like the Bureau of American Ethnology, which was really interested in having people go and record languages and cultural practices of Native American groups, because through the paradigm of the time, they thought these cultures were dying out, and so it was an act of recording and preserving and making sure that knowledge wasn't lost. Of course, we now know that that's nonsense, that those cultures haven't, quote, died out, but although some languages have gone extinct very sadly. But anyways, that was kind of a paradigm that started things, and people started to go spend time in communities, people like Frank Cushing, for example. And then in the early 20th century, though, you started to see people really doing this as like a full-time idea, and really doing field work that would take months or years to really get to know a community. People often claim that Bronislaw Malinowski, a Polish-British man, was the first one to do this. He probably wasn't, right? You had other people around the same time who were doing the same thing, and I would say potentially doing it better. Gladys Reichard was doing amazing work with Navajo people and writing ethnography that really reads more like a novel and is really compelling and really helps like delve you into the lives of like Navajo weavers. But anyways, we often start the story with Malinowski, partly because it's just kind of an interesting, funny story. Well, funny is not the right word. Interesting is. Being a British student of anthropology, but also from Poland, having been born in Krakow, Bronislaw Malinowski found himself doing research and doing a research trip in places like the Trobriand Islands in Oceania, and he expected it to be a very short trip, and lo and behold, a world war broke out. And suddenly he found that he was in a bit of an awkward situation from the eyes of the British government. They didn't want him to come back, but he also wasn't exactly an enemy, so from their point of view, so he was basically confined to the Trobriand Islands for a number of years. So at least that's the simplistic way we tell the story. As a result, he ended up doing much, much more in-depth research than anthropologists usually had, where it had been just a few weeks or something like that. And he came to realize that he was learning a whole lot more by actually spending time deeply with people than if he had, again, just gone and spent a couple of weeks with people. As he said, it allows one to grasp the native's point of view, was how he saw it, his relation to life, his vision of his world. I'd say now we're a lot more humble about that, but certainly you get to know people's meanings a lot better by spending time with them than by just assuming that you know from a few encounters with them. Malinowski was deeply problematic in other ways. He was certainly from a colonizing culture that was actively colonizing the Trobriand Islanders. This picture is chosen partly intentionally. It kind of reflects that, right? But at the same time, he did do research that, compared to the sort of armchair anthropology, was a lot more substantive. All right. After Bronislaw Malinowski, it became standard for anthropologists to spend a lot of time in the field doing their work. And nowadays, although we might not spend 2 or 3 years there, certainly spending a lot more time. And it looks different depending what you do. Some people study online cultures, in which case participant observation might be spending time in front of your computer in a specific online space. But generally speaking, it's going and being in person with the persons.